Okay, everybody, welcome back to our final session today. I'm with Dr. Pat Ogden. So Dr. Ogden is a pioneer in somatic psychology, the creator of sensorimotor psychotherapy method, and the founder of the Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute. She's a clinician, consultant, international lecturer, and the author of two groundbreaking books in somatic psychology. The first is Trauma and the Body, a sensorimotor approach to psychotherapy. And the second is Sensorimotor Psychotherapy, Interventions for Trauma and Attachment, which was published in 2015. Her third book, The Pocket Guide to Sensorimotor Psychotherapy in Context, advocates for an anti-racist perspective in psychotherapy practice. Her current interests include couples therapy, child and family therapy, social justice, diversity, inclusion, consciousness, and the philosophical and spiritual principles that underlie her work. You can learn more about Dr. Ogden's work at www.sensorimotorpsychotherapy.org. So Dr. Ogden, whenever you're ready, feel free to get started. And I'm really excited to have you on board for this event.
Thank you, Niall, and thank you for inviting me. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. I want to talk about how we are affected somatically by whatever happens to us. So this could be traumatic experiences, attachment experiences with our primary caregivers, but also relational strife of all sorts, with our peers, with our spouses, with our children, and within a larger context. And what's so fascinating to me about the body is that our bodies, in terms of our posture and movement, we will adapt without even thinking about it to all events that occur to us, to trauma, for example, when we're threatened. And the trauma could be perpetrated by individual people, or groups, or society as a whole, as colonization, transphobia, racism, systemic oppression. Those are all examples of how society can perpetrate trauma. But we also adapt to the misattunements of the people that are important to us, to our caregivers and significant others. We'll adapt. So if for example, I'm thinking my family, like my mother, she was born in 1904, and she always had the feeling that she didn't have the opportunities that I had, because women didn't even have the vote when she was growing up. They didn't have much power at all. So she was always telling me, you can do better. You could be president. You could be a doctor. You can be whoever you want. And I took that on in my body, like I mobilized and, said, okay, I'll work harder. I'll try more. So my body just automatically adapted to that, right? So I still work with shedding that and just dropping back into the back of my body instead of the front of my body and going, oh yeah, I can just relax. I don't have to work so hard to achieve. So we all grew up in some way where we got some kind of message from our family and from the rest of the world. So, in the decade of the brain in the 90s, everybody talked about how the brain is an anticipation machine, that the brain is designed to predict the future, like what's going to happen next. But our bodies do the same. Our bodies also predict the future. If you look at these drawings of different postures, different bodies, you can kind of surmise how each person would expect something different. Yeah, because these habits of posture, how we move, our physical expression, they'll reflect our history and our expectations. Like if we look at this first person here, where their body is slumped like this, like if you just do that, if you let your body slump, like right away, I feel like my interaction with you all changes, my expectation changes. Like I don't expect something uplifting. I expect something kind of that's going to defeat me, right? So each of these people expects something different. None of this is conscious. They have a different expectation. If we look at this man with his this person with their chest out like this, like mobilized, right? With chest out, shoulders back. What's he ready for? I feel like he's ready for some kind of challenge. Like, bring it on. I'm ready. I can fight back. Yeah. We have to also look at how privilege oppression dynamics might affect our physical organization. For example, if you look at this woman with her arms, folded like this, her head down, her legs are kind of crossed. I mean, if you take that on, if I take it on, I kind of feel like I want to hide, and I don't feel like I want to just express myself. I feel like I want to pull in. I don't want people to see me. And if we're thinking of our caregiver and our family dynamics, we might think, well, this woman probably grew up in a family where it was better to keep herself small, to not really show herself, to not express too much. Um, but I was talking, for example, to an Asian American woman who had a bit of this posture, kind of pulled in like that, and we were talking about it. And she said, I felt totally comfortable in my family. My parents really wanted a girl. They wanted me to express myself. They always asked my opinion. But she said, out in the world, there was so many microaggressions and so much discrimination against Asians that I didn't want to be seen, and I pulled in. So we have to think how we embody our socio-cultural history as well. Even as men and women, we are taught to live in our bodies very differently. Like women are taught to keep their bodies smaller in general. We're taught to cross our legs, don't take up a lot of space. And this is not with words, this is by example in the Western world, like just what we learned growing up female. But men, for example, there's all that, the talk about man spreading. Men can take up all the space, they can spread out, they can have their legs apart. And we know from a lot of research that when you take up more space, there's more confidence, you feel like you deserve more, and so forth. So we look at the body and the context, the context that each of us grew up in, our gender, and so forth. So in sensorimotor psychotherapy, we want to help people discover and change their physical, what I call the somatic narrative, the story the body tells. Like there's the verbal narrative is what we say, but then the body tells a story too, by how we move, how we sit, and so forth. We want to help people discover their somatic narrative, the story their body's telling, because it can just bring more resilience and more help us overcome the imprints of our past, and also help us develop more resilience in the face of ongoing oppression, which many folks still experience. So we work both with, posture, attention patterns, and specific actions. For example, if you do this with me, if you just reach out your arm. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to model it for you because I don't want you to do it the way that I would do it. Just reach out your arm in any way, like any way you want. Just reach out both arms, one arm, and notice how you're reaching out, right? Notice just, is your palm up? Is your palm down? Is your arm stiff? Is your arm held close to your body? Are you reaching out with both arms? Just notice how you're reaching. Okay, and then you can stop reaching, but remember how you reached, because the way that you reached uh, tells volumes about your history with your caregivers and your relational history. Um, John Bowlby from England, he's called the father of attachment. He identified proximity-seeking actions, and reaching is a main one. Little babies know how to reach. They don't need to be taught. They just reach out for their caregivers, right? So the way that we reach really reflects the predictions of whether other people are going to how other people are going to respond to us. Are they going to be empathic and supportive? Are they going to be rejecting? Are they going to be cold? Are they going to be abusive? Right. So these are all examples of some clients that reached out. Like this, I had a woman who reached out like this, and try that on. Like when I just asked her to reach out, kind of as a diagnostic tool, and she hunched her shoulders and reached out like this. And if you try that on and imagine that there's somebody in front of you that you want to connect with, but this is how you're reaching out, can you feel the expectation? It's not a full open palm reach. And what this client said to me, she said, well, nobody's going to be there. Like, why would I, I don't want to reach out. Nobody's going to be there. And that was her childhood history. Yeah. This client grew up in a rather abusive family dynamic. And what she said was, well, I'd like to reach out. And she reached out with both hands, but also her shoulders hunched. So there was, her shoulders represented a fear, like it was scary to reach out. Yeah. So each pattern, I'll tell you one more. This one was a man who'd come to therapy because his wife sent him because she said he wasn't emotionally available. So when I asked him to reach out, he just reached out with a stiff palm, his body pulled back, and he said, why would I ever reach to anybody else? He said, I was abused all my childhood. My mother never protected me. He said, I don't trust anybody. And that was reflected in how he reached out. Now, isn't that fascinating? So with his therapy, for example, over the course of time, he learned to reach out with an intention of really connecting with the person, but it was terrifying for him because he remembered implicitly when he reached out as a little boy, he got hurt. So he had to deal with a lot of pain and grief and so forth. So the body can be such a helpful avenue to support our own evolution and our own growth. So in sensorimotor psychotherapy, I think about kind of different kinds of injuries that involve both trauma and relationship. Trauma can refer to any, in my definition, any overwhelming experience that elicits these instinctive defenses like fight, flight, and so forth. They're instincts because when we have trauma, we feel threatened. And if we're traumatized, those experiences have not been integrated. Trauma often is relational, but doesn't have to be. You can have a skiing accident where you're just skiing and you ran into a tree or something that can be really traumatic for you, but it didn't involve another person, right? Then there are relational and developmental and societal issues. This can overlap with trauma for sure. But these, when these are non-traumatic, they're experiences with early caregivers and other relationships that cause emotional distress. Like my mother, one of the experiences I remember with my mother was I don't know if you have this where you're living, this grade system where you probably have some sort of grading system in school. In America, the highest grade was an A, right? But you could get an A plus, which was even better. And I came home from school once with A's, and my mother said something like, "Oh, honey, you're so smart. Why don't you get A pluses?" And that contributed to that mobilizing. Okay, I'll work harder. I'll do better. That wasn't traumatic for me because I didn't feel in danger, but it definitely led to belief systems like I'm not quite enough, I need to work harder, and it definitely affected my body. Um, Now, if I had somehow interpreted that statement as life or death, like if I don't get A pluses, I'm not going to be safe, then it would be a trauma. You see the difference? Then I would feel like in danger. Yeah, my arousal would shoot up. Um, so we do also identify relational trauma. That's experiences with perpetrators, caregivers, and society that are really overwhelming and experienced as dangerous, such that these instinctive defenses are stimulated. Yeah. So, there are many sources of stress and trauma. This slide just shows you, I mean, I'm sure there are many more even than I've got listed here, and they change over time. Like climate change is a newer one. Climate um, climate change is threatening, to all of us, especially non-Western countries who are experiencing the effects of climate change even more profoundly than we who lived in the Western world and created most of the, pollution, et cetera, are experiencing. Um, the pandemic the pandemic is both we have inside threat here. Inside threat means when the threat is on the inside, like if you have a heart condition or if you have cancer or diabetes, the threat is from within, but it's still a threat, and it still can still stimulate dysregulated arousal. And the COVID pandemic is interesting because it can be both an external threat where we protect ourselves with personal protective equipment, quarantining and so forth, washing our hands, but it's also can be an internal threat. Yeah. So all these are sources of trauma. And we have on here historical and collective trauma, transgenerational, colonization. I mean, these overlap, right? Oppression, colonization, and racialized trauma. So these two categories overlap. So I think one thing that is important to understand is that we can have the same traumatic experience, but it can affect us very differently. And that's because of social location, right? Social location, it describes just where we stand in these different categories in terms of privilege and or those of us who have more advantage and those of us who have less advantage. Like for me, I have a lot of advantage. I have enough money. I'm white, right? I speak the language of my country, which is English. I'm highly educated. I'm not an immigrant, right? The only less advantaged social locations that I have is that I'm a woman, right? And I'm in my 70s. So now I'm an elder, which doesn't have that respectful honor that elders used to have in the old days, right? And among a lot of, among some indigenous populations. So we really want to look at where we stand and where do our clients stand in terms of social location. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality long time ago. I can't remember when, actually, a few decades ago, to describe kind of the process and the dynamics by which these social locations interact and come together. For example, if I were a transgender woman, if my skin were dark, my skin were black and brown, if I did not have education, if I did not have enough money, and so forth, I would be much more profoundly affected by any trauma that happened to me, much more affected by the pandemic. I wouldn't have the resources to work from home and so forth. Or to get help. I mean, we could talk about this for such a long time. So this is why we have to look at context, right? What is our context that we live in, that we grew up in, and what about our clients' context? Charles Taylor, who was I'm not sure if he's still alive or not. He wrote a book in 1994 about the politics of recognition. He's a professor emeritus of philosophy. He's not a therapist at McGill University, I think. But he talks about our identity is shaped by recognition or its absence. If we have privileged and advantaged social locations, we get a lot more recognition from society, and sometimes even from our families, right? So if our identity is shaped by recognition or its absence, and he says often by the misrecognition of others, right? So a person, an individual, or a whole group of people can suffer real damage, real distortion, if the people or society around them mirror back a confining or demeaning or contemptible picture of themselves. I just love that quote, because we can think of how society as a whole mirrors back certain pictures of us depending on our social location, right? Depending on our body appearance, depending on our ethnicity, our ability, even our thinking, emotional style, whether we speak the native language of the country we live in, we're mirrored back, often demeaning pictures of ourselves by society as a whole when we occupy less advantaged social locations. It's really important to think about that, and this can be shaped by society and also by our families, of course. So misrecognition and the absence of recognition can be described in a couple of ways. Philip Bromberg, who's a dear friend, he passed away a few years ago. He said that the self that is shaped by our early interactions with our caregivers and all those patterns, it's defined by whom our caregiver both perceives us to be and denies us to be. Now think about that. Like if we think of the example I gave with myself, my mother perceived me to be, smart, and, she really encouraged ambition and all of that. But she denied my wanting to be lazy or just daydream and, not work so hard. That was denied. So in all our families, no parent's perfect. Like when I think of my son, I'm like, oh my gosh, there were never conscious denials, but we all see the other in a certain way. And for a child, that has a huge impact. Philip Bromberg, he would talk about, because our caregivers will relate to us as though we are such and such. Like my mom related to me as if I were this high achiever, super smart person, and then ignore other aspects as if they don't exist. That's how we disconfirm certain parts of ourselves. We're misrecognized, right? There's an absence of recognition. Um, and it's not negotiable. Like a child's not going to go to her mother and say, but wait a minute, you're not seeing the part of me that doesn't want to work so hard. It's not negotiable. Du Bois in 1903, he wrote about the double consciousness that Black and brown people experience, which is very much related to this core self, because with the core self, we have the person that we're mirrored by our caregivers, but then we have what Bromberg calls the not me self states, the parts of ourselves we have to push away to meet that expectation, right? Du Bois talks about the contradiction between society's perspective and one's own perspective of oneself. So the Asian American woman that I was talking about really reflected that in her body. Like in her family had instilled a very confident, they had a very positive perspective of her, but society had a very had a more demeaning perspective of her. So we want to consider both. And I experienced that as a woman. That's one of my main, one of the main marginalized status that I've lived all my life. So, for example, in doing conferences over the years, the perspective was also that I wasn't paid as much, because they didn't see me as quite as worthy as the men I was presenting with. Yeah. So we've all had those experiences, right? And this really brings out the importance of transgenerational trauma. And this is, as we wrote with my colleagues and I wrote in our book, it's an intrinsic dynamic in any country where there's a cleavage between groups that hold power versus those who do not. Like national citizens versus immigrants is a big deal in America, and I think in many countries. And the physical and psychological effects experienced by both oppressors and oppressed, subsequent generations can also experience them, right? So it doesn't stop just with the person who was abused. I had a client once, an African-American young woman, and the issue she wanted to work on was that her mother was fiercely opposed to her moving out of state. She was a dancer, she wanted to study in another state, and her mother was just fiercely opposed to it, and her mother was just going to a panic about it, and they couldn't resolve it, right? And if we look through a lens of like just attachment lens, that's a clinging, overly protective mother, right? That doesn't allow her child to follow her own dreams. If we look through the lens of transgenerational trauma and collective trauma, this family came from ancestors who were enslaved people in America. And one of the ways that the institution of slavery was kept going was by separating children from their parents. Children were sold, so the enslaved people were not allowed to form bonds. And so this had passed down implicitly through transgenerational trauma to the mother. And once that was clarified, then it was like, oh, okay. We understand, yeah. So we think about that with ourselves and our clients. Okay, wow, this is going fast. I better hurry up here. All right, so Stress and trauma, it first affects the body. This is just, it does. Like our body responds to everything. And if we feel in danger, we'll have some of these responses. We might tighten up, we might start to feel a little panicky, our heart rate might accelerate and so forth. So these are all hyperarousal symptoms. But we can also go to hypoarousal where we feel shut down and flat affect. So if we look at this window of tolerance, term coined by Dan Siegel, this window, these two lines represent a kind of a window of arousal within which we feel safe enough, regulated, we can interact with people, we feel okay, we don't feel threatened. But when we feel threatened, our physiological arousal goes over and or under the window. So what do we do when that happens? Because trauma first and foremost affects the body, what we want to work with is to do something physically that will help you regulate. And this is really important for people who experience ongoing traumatization, ongoing danger. Like one of my nephews who identifies as Black. His parents are, one's white, one's Black. He is stopped by the cops all the time, just for going for a run, for example. And when his arousal goes up, I want him to bring it down quickly, because if our arousal stays too high or too low for too long, it's going to affect our bodies. It's going to decrease our immune response, affect our heart, affect our digestion. It's not good for our bodies to have arousal perpetually in a dysregulated state. So because trauma affects our bodies first, we can do something with our bodies quickly to bring it down, okay? For example, we can ground, we can push our feet into the floor, we can feel the sense of grounding, we can take a deep breath, we can soothe ourselves with self-touch, we can do a pushing or a stop sign, we can just move, we can align our posture. Instead of our posture being like this, we might align it. We can look around and orient ourselves to our surroundings. Even a little smile, as Thich Nhat Hanh taught us, can really shift our arousal level, right? So we want to first select a somatic resource to regulate arousal, and really stay with the effects of that resource. Enjoy our arousal settling. When I first learned how to do therapy, all I learned was to talk to people. And then I met Ron Kurtz, who, this was in the 70s, the early 70s, who said, he didn't think change happened by just talking. He said, he thought change happened by looking at how we organize our experience. And that really captured my imagination, because how we organize our experience is kind of the meta level that really determines the quality of our lives. And how we organize means that if something happens to us, like if somebody if you have a boss and they criticize you, right? Each of us would respond differently to that criticism. I'd probably mobilize and go, I can do better than that. Okay, I'll do better. And I might get a little defensive as well, right? Somebody else might collapse and they might feel terrible about themselves, right? That's how we organize our experience. The boss could say the same thing to each of us would have a different reaction. That's our organization of experience. And those habits of organization will really determine our lives, right? It determines the content of our lives. So we are really less interested in the content and the conversation and more interested in how we organize. So we work a lot with mindfulness. I call it embedded relational mindfulness. And I want to acknowledge that mindfulness has its roots in Eastern practices. Western societies have appropriated mindfulness to their advantage, right? So I just want to acknowledge that. And mindfulness, in the way that we use it in the West, it really often has a very different purpose. Definitely has a different purpose when applied to psychotherapy. So mindfulness has to do with these building blocks: sensation, sensory perception, movement, emotion, and thoughts. So if our boss criticizes us, we're going to change on each of those levels, right? So I would probably mobilize a little bit. I might try to prove that I was doing a good job. I would feel maybe a little annoyed, but I might feel like a little like, a little frightened as well. I would probably have a thought that, oh God, I'm not doing good. I'm not good enough. I need to work harder. My movement, I've already demonstrated. I would have sensation. I might have an image of my mom, who was kind of critical sometimes, wanted me to do better. So that would be my organization of experience right then, how I responded. Yeah. So it's so interesting to work with the organization of experience instead of just talking all the time. So interesting to clients to discover their organization of experience. Yeah. So we organize in the face of trauma. Remember when I mentioned that trauma stimulates these instinctive defensive responses that all mammals have. It can be a cry for help, fight, flight, freeze. Those are all high arousal, sympathetic arousal states. But then there can also be a feigned death or a shutdown, a hyperarousal shutdown state. These are instinctive. And if we've all had trauma, and we can develop patterns of response to reenacted trauma. Like I've worked with so many sexual abuse survivors where their only option was to immobilize, to freeze or feign death. So in terms of other threats, they would just shut down, right? They didn't have accessible asking, crying for help, fighting back or setting a boundary or just getting away from the situation, because they developed habits of response. So we want to help people find more flexibility in these habits of response in working with trauma. I worked with a veteran once where the only instinctive defense he seemed to have available was to fight. He had such a quick trigger, and it was ruining his relationships and his job, because this was an instinctive response that he would, when he felt threatened, he would just go to a fight response. So he needed more flexibility there. So he didn't just have to fight, right? So I wanted to just mention dissociation because trauma can often elicit structural, what we call structural dissociation. And to describe it briefly is that we can have parts inside ourselves that live in what my friend Anna Vanderhart calls trauma time. We still feel scared, or we still feel like we're going to be in danger at any moment. We're still feeling as if we're living with that threat, right? So that can be one part of ourselves, but then another part, we have to get on with daily life. We have to go to work and this and that. So we try to avoid the memories of trauma. We try to avoid traumatic reminders. I had a woman, for example, many clients who experienced sexual abuse. And one client had only had sex once in her life. She was nearly 50 because she was avoiding any reminder of the abuse because she hadn't resolved the trauma. So we want to acknowledge that there can be dissociative subsystems within us that live in trauma time, but then also try to get on with life and try to push away the past trauma. And these parts, can have very different responses to stimulation. They can have different postures, different movements, and words and actions that are acceptable to one part can be really offensive to another part. So, for example, if you do this with me, I think you'll feel this in your body. If you reach out again like we did, just reach out as if you're connecting to somebody that you like, that you really want to connect with. Yeah. And just feel that reach. And then imagine that when you tried to connect in the past, you got hurt, you got hit, or you got abused. What happens to that reach? Like, I feel like I want to turn away, and my reach starts to pull back, and I start to tighten up a little bit. Like, it's just not this full open-hearted reach anymore. It's like, uh-oh, you better not do that kind of thing, right? And so those are two parts: the part that wants to be in daily life and have relationship, but then the part in trauma time is saying, uh-oh, remember when you do that, you're going to get hurt, you better not do it. So I you pull it back. So we really have to look at those different parts and how that is reflected in the body, right? Yeah, and dissociation really interfaces with systemic oppression and racialized trauma. Dissociative disorders, for marginalized people, don't just reflect individual trauma, but they also reflect racialized trauma, historical trauma, and so forth. And the other thing to think about is that for some, trauma isn't over. It's occurring, like what I mentioned with my nephew. There's ongoing economic struggle, ongoing microaggressions, ongoing crime. Marginalized communities are often disproportionately affected by crime, and the cumulative trauma from the past generations. So, as Ken Hardy says, we have to challenge an ahistorical approach. History does matter, he says. The past does affect the present, and the privileged cannot understand the subjugated out of context. And this was something I was telling Niall. I was kind of embarrassed that I learned it so late in my career, that I really didn't think about context in the 80s. It just wasn't really or the 90s, for that matter. It was mostly this century that I started to really think about the importance of context, our context and our client's context, and how those two interface. Yeah. So we think of it both when we're working with resourcing and with processing. Like, when we're working with resourcing, we're really focused on some of those resources and more that will bring arousal back into the window. But we can also focus on resources that would mitigate a relational habit. Like for me, with my history, that wasn't traumatic in my family, particularly with my mother. It really wasn't traumatic in that way. I had a lot of loss, but there was never abuse or anything. But I had that habit of living in the front of my body, like doing better. So that doesn't serve me relationally. There's too much pressure, right? So that for relationally, I need to learn to just sit back, just relax, like let it come, like not be so, out in front of myself. So we work with resources for both trauma and relationship. With processing, it's different. that's when we really go into the memories and catalyze the effects of the memory. Um, like remember when we were talking about the instinctive defenses. I'll give you an example of that. I was working with a sex worker who had been abused her whole life. She was she was in her late 30s, looked like she was in her 50s or 60s. She had suffered so much abuse and had such little self-worth. And she was talking about it the whole time. She never protected herself, but the whole time she was talking, her hands were going like this. And so if you think about that, I thought her body's telling us something. Her body's telling us of a fight pushing response that wanted to happen, but couldn't happen with all these, in all these abuse situations. So I held a pillow in front of her hands, and so she could really push out. And she said it just changed everything. She said it felt like hope to her to push because she had given up on the efficacy of that action because it had never been effective. She just stopped using it. So it just restoring a little flexibility among those instinctive defenses was life changing for her. Yeah. With attachment and relational issues, it can be a little different. How am I doing on time? Okay, we'll just take a few more minutes here. Um, I'm thinking of another client who had, he wasn't traumatized, but he had relational issues. And his body was, he said he felt like a lump. And as he exaggerated that lumpy feeling, which was just kind of the collapse, he started to feel really sad. He started to weep. He said that, he just felt like he wasn't right. It was a belief he'd learned in interaction with his family, and there's a lot of emotional pain with that. So it didn't have to do with these instinctive defenses. It had to do with using the body to go into that pain and experience that pain and start to shift that limiting belief about that he wasn't right. There was something wrong with him. Yeah. So it's different with trauma and relational issues. Trauma is mostly bottom up, working with the body, because trauma first affects the body. But relationship, we want to work with the emotions, with the body, and with the beliefs that are formed. Yeah. And then we work with how trauma and relationship overlap. Okay, one more slide, and then I want to have time for little questions. I saved the best for last. It's really these principles that guide sensorimotor psychotherapy because they create the context for the therapy. They create the atmosphere within which sensorimotor psychotherapy happens. So organicity just means that the answer is always within the client. Each person has their own intelligence inside. Yeah, if you believe that, it's easy not to push. It's easy not to be violent because all you want to do is elicit your own intelligence or elicit your client's intelligence. It's already there. Yeah. And in therapy, there's a sense of unity. We're in it together. We're creating this together. It's not separate. And we're really affected by each other. Mind, body, spirit, holism. This one always seems like just a given to me. Like the mind, body, spirit. It's all different sides of the same coin, right? And it's like one of my teachers, Ida Rolf. She said, "Well, the body's not the only thing, but it's the only thing you can get your hands on." But we're working not just with the body, with the spirit, with the mind, with the emotions, and so forth, addressing all aspects of the person. Relational alchemy just refers to that unique magic that happens between people. When two people come together, there's a novel relationship that doesn't happen in any other dyad. It's just between those two people. There's an alchemy there, right? And then mindfulness and presence, we talked about a little bit, really that sense of being with and studying that organization of experience, right? So these principles really guide my work, and I have to say my life. They're my best teachers. All right, well, thank you. If you want more information, please go to our website. And now we have a chance for some questions.
Right. So my question is, how do you deal with the body process issues that you discuss on online setting, which is coming up more and more anyway, I think.
Yeah. Oh, it is. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's so many things to say about that. I mean, if we think of those principles and the idea of unity, you know, I really bring it out to the open with my client. Like I'm saying, you know, things are going to change if we're working online. Like, how about if I ask you, can I ask you more questions about your body? Because I can't see your whole body. Is that okay with you? And, you know, maybe you can tell me more about how you're feeling in your body so we can really track it, you know, and we'll use body therapy can really be done online. In fact, if you go to our website, there's actually 2 whole hours of that's pro bono of talk about how to do body therapy online. So that might be helpful with you.
Yes, thank you. That sounds really helpful. I mean, I've done some training online, but this is very unique to the body and, you know, very focused on the body. So I just was wondering if it's possible to do it. Yeah.
Oh, it's really possible. I mean, for me, because I can, you know, I have like a you know, moving chair, and so I can demonstrate different actions and movements and easily. But but it catches on my clothing sometimes. One of my students said, well, yeah, they just put a mat under their chair, like a rug, and they could scoot back and forth too. So there's all kinds of little tricks. And
oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. This has been really, really helpful.
Oh, great.
I'm just interested because I trained in transactional analysis and then I did trauma training after that. And sensorimotor was kind of touched on, but not in any depth because of the length of the course. I'm just interested in kind of what a sensorimotor session actually looks like with a client. Like what do you do within the session? And also I'm interested in whether there's a specific way of dealing with transgenerational trauma, or do we treat it basically as trauma?
Oh gosh, those are big questions. I mean, I was smiling because it's so hard to say what a session looks like because every session is so different, you know. I think hallmarks of the session, of any session, is just including the body all along the way. Like I always tell you know, my students, no matter what the client presents with, the body is going to participate in that. So whatever problem they have, the body is going to participate, and therefore the body is going to be a primary avenue for resolution of that. So if a client comes in and says, you know, I'm not getting any support from my husband, for example, if they come in with that, you want to look right away, how is the body reflecting that? Like I'm thinking of the client who's just like exasperated and, you know, kind of gave up, kind of collapsed around it. So that was her participation. Like she wasn't getting support from her husband. Well, she never asked for it, and she would get angry about it. And, you know, and so, but her body participated immediately. So therefore we could start to work with that mind-body interface. But each session, you know, it has a beginning and a middle and an end. And we're looking at how I mean, because we're alive, we're always changing. There's always some transformation in a session. There's always something that shifts because we're alive. Yeah. So we're looking for that shift and how a client can more fully embrace that shift. And then I almost always give homework because the patterns that we have, they weren't developed overnight and they're not going to change with one session. So if that client that we were talking about, she doesn't ask for support and then she gets mad, you know, her homework would be to okay, how can you ask? Like, if you imagine asking, how can you embody a stance that asks without, with putting that anger aside? Like, how can you embody the stance that asks that you get what you get your request met? So I don't know if that answers your question, Shauna, but that's
It does, but
yeah.
also with dissociation, I've had clients who and colleagues have had clients who are not very aware of their body. And I
Yes.
guess I'm wondering whether you've got any tips for working with somebody when you need to do body psychotherapy, but they're dissociated in some way from their body.
Yeah, absolutely. I just did a gosh, I think it's about 8-hour course with Pessy, a masterclass where I demonstrated working with a complex trauma dissociative client. I work with an actor, though. I don't use my real client for that. I don't feel I wouldn't feel good with that to really demonstrate it, because there's all kinds of ways, and because people have been, like frightened out of their bodies, and the body's been the battleground, so it often doesn't feel safe to re-enter the body. So, I mean, again, it's so highly individual. I would try to help a client find ways where they did enjoy their bodies, like through eating or going for a walk or taking a bath. Trying to find a place in their body that they felt safe connecting with. Like the one client I worked with, she didn't want to feel her body. She couldn't feel her body. It was just numb. But she was a secretary, and she typed a lot. And she was willing at the beginning to feel the movement of her fingers. Like that felt safe to her. That was all she could feel of her body. So we want to find those inroads that feel safe and comfortable, and then build from there.
It's from Tanya, and Tanya asks, a client is burnt out from their job and has quit. She avoids working with others. She's got trust issues and she's scared that others will take advantage of her. What would you advise to help her move forward?
The first thing that I think of is I wonder how she lives in her body. Because if she doesn't trust and doesn't trust others, and sounds like she's not having satisfying relationships, I imagine she's either tight or pulled back and can't, doesn't feel safe with other people. So I would work with boundaries. I would work with pushing motion. I would help her feel that she could protect herself, that she had a space. Do this motion often. This is your space. What's that like when this is your space? You have the say whether to connect or keep out. I had one client, for example, that I'm thinking of, where she was highly distrustful and had been abused. And I had many clients that I worked with this gesture. So she wasn't safe connecting with others, so she couldn't do that reach gesture, but she really wanted to connect. And when she did, she got this pushing gesture in, and that felt good to her, but she still felt alone. So what we ended up doing was this gesture, like reaching but still having this protection. Yeah, and that was a wonderful action for her. Yeah. So we find ways to work through the body that address exactly the issues that she's struggling with.
That's really interesting. Makes a lot of sense. Okay. I just got a question here as well that sprung to mind. So we've got a lot of people that are on the call that are on the webinar that are sort of early stage in their career of psychotherapy or counseling. And I'm just curious to ask, if you were to go back to before you started training as a psychotherapist or as a psychologist, how would you approach your training now, knowing everything that you now know about, psychotherapy and training in these things?
Well, you're asking a person who, I started in the 60s. I started teaching yoga and dance in a psychiatric hospital. I had no training. I had studied dance all my life. I learned yoga from a book. That taught me more than anything, and I had a very different experience because I wasn't trained traditionally until I was in my 50s. I worked with alternative body therapies and movement therapies, hands-on structural body work. I don't know that I personally would change anything, because I don't think that's available these days. You know, in those days, you didn't, I started practicing in my 70s, in the 70s, but you didn't have to have a license or anything. I'm not saying we should go back to that, because I think there could be a lot of harm done. But I learned from my clients and from like leaders in the field, you know. It wasn't until I didn't get a graduate degree in psychology. I had a graduate degree in teaching. I didn't get a graduate degree in psychology until I was already teaching all over the world, you know. And so I treasure that, my education, but it was completely unconventional and it was very experiential. I do think, I mean, I think that's why some of the trainings that are experiential, like our training is very experiential, where people learn from the inside about their body, because, you know, students practice with each other, the interventions and the techniques. And there are a lot of trainings that are experiential. I'm a hands-on learner. That's what feeds me. You know, I learn by doing, rather than just from books. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I wouldn't change how I wouldn't do it differently. I'm really glad I didn't go to school first and get my degree in psychology first. So
It's really interesting. It sounds like, you know, there's a big element there of experimentation and following what you were naturally curious about, you know, and
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and those were the days where that was, you know, and since then there's been so much rules and regulations, and I think many of them were kind of needed, because there can be harm when you learn that way too. But I was really lucky. I had incredible teachers and masters of different disciplines like body therapy and, you know, structural body work and, you know, so I was really lucky. Yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, Dr. Ogden, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us here today. I think everybody's had got loads from that session. So thank you very much. People can get the book on the usual places. Where just Amazon on your website, or anywhere else they can find that. Lali's just linking that in the chat as well, the website. So Sensorimotor Psychotherapy.org. Again, thank you so much, and enjoy your Sunday.
Thank you, Niall. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.
Take care.
Bye-bye.